Hi, my name is Chris Wolfe. I'm co-director of the Thomas International Center, and this is the 6th class in our short course on the goals of American government and the Declaration of Independence, part of our longer American constitutional principles class. So far, we've looked at the self-evident principles of the Declaration of Independence, and in particular, that one that focuses on the reason for government. Governments are instituted among men to secure rights. So now that we've gone through those self-evident principles and gotten a general idea of what the founders thought American government was oriented toward, what I'd like to do now is spend a class or two talking about contrasting understandings of what government is about. American government clearly reflects the influence of modern political philosophy, and particularly Hobbes and Locke, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And I want to talk about the differences between that and more classical political philosophy, especially Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, as well as certain modifications through the Middle Ages with St. Augustine and St. Thomas. So to give more clarity about what's distinctive about American government, I want to look at classical political philosophy in order to highlight the differences between the two, maybe talk a little bit about what led to the shift from one to the other, and whether that shift was as complete as sometimes it might seem to some people. So let me start off by asking some questions. Is it so obvious that political philosophy should start where it starts with Hobbes and Locke and with the Declaration? First of all, in particular, should we start with individual self-preservation as the kind of bedrock, bottom, foundational principle? Is it obvious that individual self-preservation should be the starting point? Why not something like the common good? When we think of political life, we think of communities. Why not start with the common good rather than with individuals? Or why wouldn't we start with human happiness rather than focusing on the desire for self-preservation? Should we focus on human goods rather than on rights? I mean, these are all questions we should naturally think about, but of course we're so used to the Declaration's principles, which we kind of breathe in from the atmosphere in which we grow up, that sometimes we don't think about alternative ways that we might approach the same question. Again, if we have individuals in a state of nature, why would we start with a state of nature? Have there ever been people in a state of nature? Where did this isolated individual come from? Did the individual come, I presume, from families? But the family is a community, and isn't that a somewhat different starting point from the isolated individual in the state of nature? Or why do we start with rights again? I mean, the rights tend to be kind of immunities, walls against other people, or in some cases, a right to something from other people. But why focus on that? Why not just focus on, as a starting point, what would be good for us? Good for me as an individual, good for the people that are part of the community that I form part of, or the goods of human beings rather than rights. Those are two different starting points, and it's not immediately clear why we should start where the Declaration starts. So as an alternative approach, I want to take the example of Aristotle, who discusses many of these issues in his Politics, in some ways the first great treatise on political science. And I want to try to elaborate the Aristotelian understanding as a way of seeing the contrast between the classical understanding of what government's about with the modern understanding. So where do we start with Aristotle? I think with Aristotle we start with organic communities, not with an isolated individual in the state of nature, but with human beings as I think they probably actually are. Where do human beings come from? They don't spring out of the ground as isolated individuals. They start in families. That is, from the very beginning, human beings are parts of communities. And that first community is the family, but it's a limited community. It's obviously what you need to do, the coming together of a man and woman that produces children. So for human society to continue in existence, you need that. But at that first level, if all you had was the family, if all you had was a mother and a father and children, then there's not a whole lot you could do, actually, because with just that family unit, you'd be struggling to stay alive. I mean, there's just so much work you would have to do just to maintain your existence. So that family tends to develop fairly quickly through blood relations into something larger. Aristotle calls it something like a village, which is really a kind of an extended network of people that probably begins with a core of several different families, a number of different families. And as they expand and then eventually more distant parts intermarry, you get a village. But at this stage, the second stage, Aristotle thinks that the focus is still on what you might call mere life. That is, the focus is on just doing what you need to do to stay alive. Because, of course, in modern civilized societies, we don't think about this much, but that's a pretty tall order when you're in a situation where you had a really isolated group of human beings in a small territory. Imagine yourself, your family being dumped on an island and then having somehow to survive without contact with other people. It would be pretty difficult, and you'd spend an awful lot of your time simply trying to stay alive. I remember a couple of years ago with my family, I was watching one of these reality TV shows, and it was about a pioneer family. And they followed some people who kind of lived a pioneer life for a couple of months. I think it was during the late summer or fall, as I recall. And one of the things the guys had to do, the men, was to chop wood. And they chopped and chopped and chopped and had more or less success. One guy had a really long line of wood. And at the end of the show, some experts came in and they kind of said, well, okay, given what you've been able to do and store up during the late summer and fall, this is what would happen. You would die in December, you would die in January, and you, the longest one, you might make it till February. But the climate being what it is, probably even the family with the most wood would have probably run out of wood in February and just died of the cold shortly after that. So we take for granted the civilization that we're a part of, and we sometimes think that intellectually we can separate ourselves from others, but we really are deeply nested in this larger community. And so we have to think back to these earlier communities and think, well, what would it have been like to live at that level of human existence? And the answer is a lot of hard work just to stay alive, okay? So that's true of the family, the household, and then it's true of the second level of the village. Now, what Aristotle argues is that at a certain point, you go past a tipping point where you have what he calls the polis. And the polis is a self-sufficient community. And what he means by that is that you're able to accumulate enough resources, not just to survive, to stay alive, not just to have the goal of mere life, but at some point you have a certain kind of surplus of resources that you can use for other things besides just staying alive. And in particular, you have resources to do a lot of other things that develop other aspects of the human being. For example, when you're on the pioneer frontier just struggling to stay alive, you're probably going to have a tough time developing, let's say, music and the arts. You might be able to do certain rudimentary things, but to develop the arts much more. You need people who have time to really focus on that, which involves a certain surplus of labor over and above what's minimally necessary to stay alive. You probably can't have a university, if what you have is just a few small families trying to stay alive, or just a small village. You have to get to the point where you have a certain surplus of resources that makes it possible to devote time and resources in a way to what you might call unnecessary things. Not the things that are absolutely necessary just to stay alive, but the things that you do because they're good in themselves. This is the whole concept or idea of leisure. Nowadays when we hear the word leisure, somebody's living a life of leisure, what it usually means is somebody's goofing off. They're relaxing, they're resting, they're having entertainment. The original notion of leisure is the things you can do that aren't required by necessity. That is, they're not a matter of simply staying alive. And it's really traditionally associated with what a free person can do. The person who has time, not just to work on things to stay alive, but to develop a whole range of human abilities. It might be the arts, it might be intellectual abilities, such as education and reading, things of that sort. So the polis is really something distinctive and new. It doesn't come into existence just for mere life. It originates perhaps in a family, a household, and a village that existed for mere life. But once you reach the polis, you now have something that exists for the good life. That is, for the full development of a wide range of human abilities. And so that's when you get to what Aristotle calls the polis, or politics, where you have a genuine common good that permits the fuller development of human beings. Okay, so that's the starting point for Aristotle. Now, when you reach that point, the common good consists precisely in that development of a wide range of human goods. It means individual development, that the members of society are able to do many things that aren't just required by necessity. Of course, no particular individual can develop all the human capacities to the fullest. If you're going to be a Mozart, you're probably not going to be a, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or Kevin Durant, or if you have athletic abilities and have arts abilities, educational abilities, they require, for their really full development, probably a real focus, a kind of specialization. And that's why when you have a political community, it involves not just the individuals developing themselves, but also a certain kind of division of labor, that there's a variety of people pursuing different goods. And as we'll see, it's also possible for other people to share in those goods as well. So you have this idea of a common good that involves the fuller development of the individual, but also a fuller development of the whole community as well, and its common life. Now, I think the notion of the common good is very difficult for modern people to understand. It's a little bit foreign to us in some ways, I think. And the reason is because modern ideas of the common good tend to be really something more like what you might call the public interest, or what's often called the public interest in modern political thought. And it focuses especially on things like, for instance, having a high GDP, gross domestic product. If you have a wealthier society, society is likely to be better off, it's thought, because that wealth can be spread out among the people and give them all more opportunities. Of course, there's a very strong core of truth to that can be beneficial. But if you focus simply on goods like the gross domestic product, there's something about that makes the idea of the common good harder to get a handle on. What's distinctive about something like gross domestic product is that you end up divvying up those things among the individuals in society. That is, if you're talking about material goods in particular, in some sense, human beings don't really share material goods by and large. What they usually do is they divide material goods up. So the idea of sharing is, well, you have this kind of pile that you're sharing, but then you divvy it up and each person, each family gets its own. And in some sense, that's less a real sharing. Now, to get across the idea of the classical common good, I want to take two analogies from contemporary life that I think may give a bit better idea of what a true common good might be. And the two analogies are, first, the family, and second, sports teams. So let's turn to the family. Family, we have parents, we have children. In some sense, you might say, a very fundamental sense, parents are the rulers of the family. They have a certain special charge for the common good, have to direct the family for the good of the whole family, for themselves, for the children, and for the common life they share together. So what is the goal of those rulers? Ask yourself, those of you who are students, or maybe those of you who are parents, as a parent, as a mother and a father, what is it that I am trying to achieve? What is the goal of my life? The goal of the family? Well, of course, one obvious thing that many people think of immediately is, well, we have to support ourselves. It's necessary for the family, especially for the parents, to support the family. Children come into existence very needy, very unable to support themselves, and they're extremely dependent on parents for a very long period of time. In the animal kingdom, it's very unusual. I remember a couple of years ago, my family went on a vacation for a couple of weeks, and the front door we have this little octagonal window with a ledge on the outside. And we came back, and just being away for a week or two, it was in the spring, a robin had built a nest there. And so, I guess the robin decided that she was going to hunker down there and not leave, even though we were home. So every time we went in and out the front door, she'd fly away and come back and try to distract us. But she didn't leave, and the result was that from the inside of the house through the window, we were able to see, the robin's family life unfolding that spring. So we had the robin there, and then eventually there were the eggs, and then the mother sitting on the eggs, and then the eggs cracked, and eventually the robins, after eating for a little while, eventually got kicked out of the nest. The thing that was shocking to us in a way was how quickly the robins got kicked out of the nest. They were there for a fairly short period of time. I don't know, maybe it was a couple of weeks or something. And the result was that one day the mother just decided, she knew by instinct, hey, this is the time, and she's boom, she just kicked the kids out, and they had to go off on their own and support themselves. What would you do with a human child if, after a couple of weeks or a couple of months, you just said, boom, you're out of here, go support yourself? It's not going to happen, right? The thing that's really distinctive about human beings is what a long time it takes for the children to develop. So that's the first, in some ways, the most obvious thing that parents think of as their responsibility. I got to keep this kid alive. I got to, help it to develop in very rudimentary ways. And that's obviously really important. It's something we all have to do. And yet, I don't think anybody would be satisfied with just that. Certainly we want to provide children with support, and also, as an essential part of that, we want to teach them to support themselves. So, as the children get older, we have to educate them in various ways, including, very importantly, how to support themselves, what kind of work they can do so that they can go out on their own and then eventually have their own families. So, would a parent feel that he or she had succeeded? Would parents feel that they had succeeded if, they had a child who, got to, adulthood and was very well taken care of, had a good job, was financially self-supporting, enjoying their work, and we just leave it at that. You know, let's say that's our description of the family. Would we assume that the family is a success? Well, you know, I think we'd have to ask some more questions, you know, because I think in some respects that would be success, but if we dig more deeper into what's actually being done, we might wonder. So for example, what if the job that our son got was something that he was, you know, very able to live on, you know, it provided him with a very good living, but let's say he was the enforcer for a loan shark. And so what he did for a living was go out and shake down other people and beat them up if they didn't pay their money to the loan shark. He certainly would be supporting himself. Would we say that parents had been successful? Or if your oldest daughter went out and she was very successful because she was the highest paid prostitute in the city, you know, would we say, oh, that's a successful parent? I think not, right? That is, clearly besides the economic component, there's also the whole question of living a certain way of life, you know, the moral component. We think that some lives are good lives. We think some lives are bad lives. Well, if that's the case, then the parent's responsibility is not just, you know, providing material goods, you know, it's providing this moral life as well. It's providing a certain kind of moral guidance which helps the children to understand what a good life is. Now, how do parents go about doing that? You know, what's involved in this whole task of developing these good moral qualities? You know, basically what we're talking about is we're talking about virtue. You know, we're talking about excellence. And again, I mean, one way of looking at that is we're not just teaching our kids to be successful at having mere life, that is, at preserving themselves, even preserving themselves comfortably. We're talking about how can they live the good life, you know, the life of a fuller, richer, more developed human being. The Greek word for this was arete. That is, it's translated variously. Could be translated virtue. But, you know, nowadays in our society, too often virtue is associated with, you know, a list of no-nos, you know, things that we can't do. You know, we're virtuous if we don't do these bad things. Well, the fact of the matter is that virtue is a lot more than that. The other way you can translate arete is excellence. And that's what we as parents aim for our children. We want them to be excellent human beings. We want them to help them to see what it means to be a good human being. Now, it doesn't mean there's just one good way of being a human being. Of course, there are lots of different ways to do that. But there's certain core concepts. And I think the core concept certainly is virtue. For example, we'd like our kids to have certain intellectual virtues. We'd like them to have a certain wisdom, an ability to kind of see the world and understand the world and what human life is about, what the universe is about. We'd like to see them have the intellectual virtue of prudence, too. In addition, we'd like to have the moral virtues, which are all in the service of the intellectual virtues. Prudence is a kind of intermediate virtue because it means that we have a certain understanding of what the good life is, what the good is, and then we have to devise means to achieve those goods, to figure out what's the action I should take in this set of circumstances in order to achieve the good I'm pursuing. And then there are other important moral virtues as well. One of them is justice, giving to each person his or her due. You know, this is basically something that regulates our relations with other people. It includes various aspects. It might be the relationship between individuals. It might include something like commutative justice, the justice of exchange. But it also includes distributive justice as well, especially in a larger community, what the distribution of honors and responsibilities and duties is in the community. And that each person should have what is due to him is the key notion of justice. And we'd certainly want our children to be just, one way. And then we'd also want the children to have the virtue of fortitude. You know, it's easy for people to be diverted from the good if there's pain involved in pursuing the good. And so it takes a certain kind of fortitude to resist that pain and to keep locked on the good. Of course, the greatest, source of fear is death. In some ways, the classic form of fortitude is the willingness to go into battle and, if necessary, die in order to serve one's country, in order to protect one's country, including all the members of it, and including one's family. And so the virtue of fortitude is something that can demand a high price sometimes. But then, of course, it's a part of all our life, that we can be diverted from doing the good because we don't want to pay a price, some kind of pain or discomfort that might be associated with, being really locked on the pursuit of the good. Then there's temperance. And temperance involves not being diverted from the good by pleasure. It's easy for us to be, in a way, seduced away from pursuing the good when we have a strong pleasure. Pleasures involved in food and drink and sex being perhaps the most powerful. And they can distort our vision of what the good is and whether we should pursue it. And so these are classically called the cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Of course, you can elaborate many other virtues as well, which are related to these virtues. So intellectual virtue and moral virtue, aren't these things that as parents we'd want our children to have? And in some sense, isn't that even more important? It may be necessary. We focus on the necessity of providing our kids with material things, but providing them with intellectual and moral goods, those are the things that are proper to human beings, what distinguish us in some special way from the animals. And the animals all have mere life, but they don't have the kind of intellectual and moral virtue that human beings are capable of and aspire to. Now, we want our kids to have these intellectual and moral virtues. How do we go about doing that? Well, that's a pretty complex process. All kinds of books written on parenthood, right? Well, when they're younger, the key thing to understand is that virtues are habits. That is, they're dispositions to act in a certain way easily, with facility. Take a really simple example, just starting with something physical. You might say that there's a virtue, excellence, associated with tennis. And what that means is basically that you have to develop certain habits. And how do you develop them? You simply repeat actions over and over again until they become easy to do. So if you're going to play tennis, you have to learn how to have a stance, and then you have to hit forehands. You have to bring your racket back. You have to step forward, hit the ball right off your front foot. You have to follow through, coming over a little bit. So you have to have that. And how do you learn how to do that? You have to do it over and over again, hitting balls over and over again. Because in the middle of a match, you can't stop and think about what you're doing. It's got to be something that's a part of you, that you've done it so often, it's developed into a habit. Okay? So it's true of physical skills, but it's also true of moral life as well. We're all of us perhaps tempted at different times to be angry. We want to do something or get something and we can't do it. We think somebody else has interfered and we can get angry about that. Well, some of us get very angry and very often, and that's not too good a thing. It's not great for social life when somebody has a short fuse and is always kind of flipping off and getting angry. Well, when we're young, we have to develop a certain capacity to control that anger. How do you do that? You do it the same way you do it with other things. That is, by repeated actions. That is, you feel the temptation to act in a certain way, to get angry, and you stop and you don't do it. You control your temper. And you control it, you do it over and over again, and that helps you to develop this capacity to control your temper more easily. Okay? So we have lots of different ways of developing habits. When kids are really young, what it usually means is that parents have to basically make their kids do it. You know, you don't explain to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old why you do something. You know, but for example, you don't let a 4-year-old just eat as much as he wants, whatever he wants, whenever he wants. You know, that would be a real problem for temperance. You know, he might have a difficulty controlling that appetite. He has to be able to control the appetite for food. So a parent will regulate the amount of food and the kinds of food. We don't want, you know, a kid just eating, you know, Hostess Twinkies all day. Not particularly great for nutrition, right? So that's a potential problem. So parents start out by getting kids to act in a certain way, in some sense you might say coercively, but still, as the kids get older, that's going to shift, right? Because the goal ultimately is to have the child become an adult who takes over the direction of his or her own life. And I'll continue talking about that more in our next class. Thank you.